Hi there, I'm John, the author of Democracy Squared, and I've been asked today to share some perspectives and reflections I have on a lot of the conversation that's happening today around news and current affairs, and specifically around technology's role in some of the stuff we're seeing around the world at the moment. The main message that I think I want to give today is that I think we're still having the same conversations we've always been having. We're just having them in a slightly new way, and that there might be a very alternative and deeper conversation to have about the system that we're living in and technology's role in that. And so I'll say a little bit about the first bit first, and that's why do I think that the conversation is the same? And the reason is because everything I've heard said about technology's role in both the US elections and the British referendum has been around social media, basically. So both in terms of filter bubbles and fake news, the conversation has been about media. And we've always had conversation about media and media's role in politics. It's just that now we have new forms of media. So filter bubbles is this notion that we are all listening to the same perspectives as us in little echo chambers on the internet. And that, I think, is in no way a new thing. I tend to read papers that agree with me. My grandma has been reading the Daily Mail since a long, long time. I have friends who are avid Guardian readers, and I think there's a natural human bias to read stuff that agrees with us, and now there are algorithms that are filtering that more and more. So maybe we could argue that it's happening on a bigger scale than before, but I think by no means is it happening. Is it a new thing? And the second thing is this conversation about fake news. So we've heard a lot about fake news and its role potentially in different elections. And again, I think it's happening on a greater scale than before. But journalism and media has traditionally been a place that sells their ideas, and therefore sometimes will manufacture stories and facts in order to present those ideas in the best way possible. So that is also something that I don't think is new. It's just happening in new ways. And that's why I think we're still having the same conversation. Now, the more interesting conversation for me to have would be around how could technology restructure democracy and really change it. So if you think democracy, the Western model of democracy is representative, and that is an assumed truth that it must be. And it has been the case for 300 years, and it's not really changed in that time. But in the last 25 years since Tim Berners-Lee invented the internet, it hasn't changed at all. So we have a system that is using old technology, essentially pen and paper, to make these decisions rather than new technology. And we still have politicians at the head of that. And I don't have a specific perspective on the solution. I just see a number of trends and experiments from around the world that might point us in new directions. So the first point I want to make is that this conversation about media and politics is very relevant because I think politicians and media organizations are in the same industry. They're in the industry of selling us ideas and us buying those ideas. We either buy those ideas by buying their products and services, or we buy those ideas through a vote. So it's just a different currency, but it's the same industry. And if we really question democracy, we can re-question the power that media has and that politicians have in our democracies and in our systems. So the first thing is to think of what is democracy, and the best definition I've heard and I adhere to is the idea that democracy is the enactment of the will of the people. Now, in order to understand the will of the people, logic would dictate that you would have to ask the people for their will. Now, in a pen and paper society, when that was our best technology, the only way that we could listen to the will of the people and scale that sort of listening mechanism was through cycles of voting. So every 4 years, typically, we get to go to the ballot box and make a decision. And often, in most democracies, that decision is pretty binary. It's left or right, it's red or blue, it's in or out. And that doesn't take into account any of the nuance necessary to really understand the will of the people. I am a complex, messy, fucked up human being, and I have a load of different perspectives about a load of different things, and so does everyone. And no one ideology can possibly cater for all of my beliefs. But in a party system, particularly a two-party system, that's my only real form of expression. And so that system can't possibly operate. Now, we are no longer in a pen and paper society. We now have a load of technology that can help us make these more nuanced decisions. So I think that's really key to understand. If we were to redesign democracy based on being in 2017 and having the internet, then I think the form of democracy we would come to would be a very different one. And that's fundamental. So we have technologies like blockchain, AI, and even something as rudimentary as the fact that we all have mobile phones must surely have implications on how we run our democracy. So if I think of blockchain, the application of blockchain is very interesting. So using a form of crypto code, essentially, in order to be able to listen to lots of different decisions without mass corruption is a really interesting new technology to build our democracy on. And it's one where someone I interviewed for Democracy Squared said it's a world where the network could be sovereign. And what I've seen is in Australia, for instance, there's the launch of a movement called My Vote, and My Vote are using blockchain technology in order to consult the people on every single policy that goes through government, with the understanding that in the 21st century there's not much of an excuse to not ask the people what they believe on every single topic, because that's what democracy is, enacting their will. Another thing is AI, and I think AI is interesting. It's dangerous and scary for lots of reasons, of course, but there's been an application that's been really modern and interesting and contemporary, and that's been in Taiwan. So what they've done in Taiwan is they've used a system called Polis, where you are able to give a perspective qualitatively through this application, and over time the machine starts to figure out what people are agreeing and disagreeing on. And what it found was that whilst there was a load of polarization and disagreement on a number of topics, there was one specific topic where 92% of the people who were involved, which was in the thousands, agreed that, for instance, Uber drivers should be checked. They should be vetted in some way before being able to become certified Uber drivers. And 92% of the people who partook agreed with that. And so that was a really interesting moment where machine learning is now able to create coherence on that mass conversation that's happening. Now, we've seen other things, like in Argentina, there's been a dummy party created called the Red Party using an app called Democracy OS, where those people, part of the party, will do whatever the people say on this application, and basically showing the fact that maybe their party isn't even needed, but also holding politicians accountable for what people really want, because the discrepancy becomes very obvious. Now, I don't think any of these are singular solutions to all of the problems in the world, but what they do show to me is that there are a number of different ways in which we can design our democracies, which aren't being thought through at the moment. Now, I hear a few regular sort of bits of cynicism that come to me. One is, but there are loads of stupid people, and should we let stupid people vote on everything? And I think that, I can't remember the exact number, but there's an interesting stat, basically, that like 70% of the world think that they're smarter than average, which is, of course, a statistically flawed thing to say. And so the idea that there are stupid and non-stupid people is there a little bit interesting. But also, I think by stupid, we often mean a different perspective, and a different perspective is what makes a democracy. And therefore, what I think people are often saying is, can't people who don't share my perspective vote? And my answer is, they're already voting. That's already how this is working. If anything, mathematically, you take away the risk of extremism, because our decisions and our input is spread over so many decisions so often on a continuous and liquid basis, that less power is attributed to each of those decisions. So therefore, the chance of extremism becomes very different. Also, the number of different choices that can be made mean that no single ideology can govern in that system. And the media would also find it difficult, because it would be more difficult to win on every single conversation in terms of promoting their ideology, or for politicians, in fact, to do that. So I think that's a really interesting thing. Finally, what I want to say is, there's been this thought recently about a rise in nationalism, and I don't adhere to that. I think that is a symptom of something else. What we're actually seeing is a rise in people voting for something different. A lot of people call the "fuck you" vote. There's a lot of people voting for what is not the norm, and that's what we're really seeing, I think. And what that vote is to me is a vote against a system which doesn't work, a linear industrial system based on industrial logic, in a world which operates on internet logic. It's also why I think we see young people vote less and less, because by not voting, they are voting for the right to a different way of running our democracies. Now, where is this going? I don't know. I know that it will be difficult for politicians, certainly, to adhere to this kind of thinking, because their very power will be questioned in the kind of system which I'm discussing, or the kind of alternative uses of technology to empower society. That will be questioned. And the other thing is that there's surely some sort of generational gap going on. There's generations of people who are brought without an interconnected society, and there's generations of people who are brought up with interconnected society. And regardless of age, there are mindsets that adhere to either of those camps, which in the New York Times was called webs versus walls. And I think it's really interesting to think of the world in that way. So I don't know what's going to happen in the near future, but I really hope that we'll have more democratic movements using technology to really listen to the will of the people in order to enact that will. And I think some of these technologies, by My Vote in Australia, Democracy OS, Democracy Earth, Polis, etc., could be pointing that way. So I think this discussion can go on for a lot longer, and I'd love to have it with you. Please join me, John Barnes, author of Democracy Squared, and let's discuss this soon. Thank you. Goodbye.